When the American continents were discovered, nearly every major European power grabbed at the opportunity to seize a portion of the promising new land for themselves, whether as land for settlers, a resource hub to enrich the mainland, or as a mere status symbol of imperial might. However, when the continent of Australia was discovered, basically just Britain came in and took it all. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline there was a scramble for Australia? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's donated to us on Patreon, Utreon, and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Your donations really go a long way to keeping this channel going, and by donating to us across any of these platforms, you'll get access to some great perks including physical merch, a custom designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos. You can follow the pop-up on screen here, go to the comment section or description to visit any of these pages and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video. Before the British came along, Australia had been discovered and technically claimed by the Dutch as the colony of New Holland. The land, however, was regarded as being inhospitable and without promise. It's also important to remember that while the Dutch Empire had fallen into decline, Britain's empire was rapidly rising. The time in which Britain had begun colonizing Australia, using it as a penal colony for convicts to not take up additional room in the already overcrowded mainland, would have been a period of virtual British monopoly over imperial power. Both France and Sweden had sought to explore colonization efforts in 1788, but found themselves both sidetracked by severe hindrances. From 1788 to 1830, France's monarchy would be overthrown, the country would fall into bloody revolution, Napoleon would rise to power and drag the rest of the continent into war, with the country being left nearly just as unstable in the immediate years following. Sweden would be weakened by war with Russia, losing its Finnish territories and slowly drifted toward neutrality. Spain had long since fallen as a mighty and capable imperial power and was further weakened by Napoleon, seeing nearly all of its American colonies break away, all of which prevented the Spaniards from following through on a plan to capture Britain's Australian colonies during this time. Portugal would struggle to repel Bonapartist influence and would not be in a position to pursue ambitious colonial policies beyond those already established. The Dutch would be conquered by France and see their colonies held by Britain for the duration of the Napoleonic Wars, not fully recovering as an imperial power even afterward. And Prussia, Austria, and Russia would not be in a convenient position to pursue colonization, lacking major seafaring navies on par with Britain, and of course needing to combat Napoleon up until 1815. In this context, it seems more sensible that Britain had been the sole power to dominate Australia, but despite this, there were still rumblings occurring within Europe. Russia had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as one of the most unscathed and powerful European powers. France had been seeking an opportunity to regain its status as a great power of Europe and would in 1830 conquer and begin colonizing Algeria right across the Mediterranean. Having lost South Africa and technically Australia to Britain, the Dutch would attempt to compensate by increasing their colonization efforts in Indonesia. Sweden was industrializing and modernizing while attempting to strengthen its personal union with Norway. Spain was witnessing the growth of the Philippines into a valuable asset and briefly attempted to restore its pre-war might. And Portugal, having lost Brazil in 1822, would begin seeking an expansion of its port colonies in Africa and the Indo-Pacific. What this amounted to was a growing potential for largely unclaimed Australia to be contested and partitioned. But by the time countries like France began re-exploring the prospect of colonizing parts of Australia, Britain had rapidly begun locking them out by establishing settlements along the coast in areas of any considerable value. Neither France nor any of the other powers would challenge Britain's position, not believing that war for Australia was worthwhile. But this time, things are different. In the 1820s, as Britain began expanding its claims beyond the southeast, and this time around without recognition of Dutch claims on the west, an alliance of France, Spain, and the Netherlands would gather together to challenge Britain across the north and west of the continent. France would have recently aided the Spanish king in restoring his absolute power in Spain, leaving him indebted to the French, while the Netherlands would find itself increasingly focused on developing Indonesia, seeing the potential for an Australian outpost as a valuable asset. Britain would hold the upper hand in naval might, but recognizing the great loss that would result from continuing war with the three European powers, as well as its only recent expansion beyond eastern Australia, would call for a formal partitioning of Australian lands in a fashion similar to what would be seen with the Berlin Conference later down the line. Britain's ally of Portugal would also be invited to the negotiating table along with neutral Sweden as a means for the British to deny strategically valuable lands to France. Britain would come away with the largest share of land, establishing a border roughly dividing the continent in half and following several inland rivers. Sweden and Portugal would gain neighboring lands, Sweden gaining the coastline along the Gulf of Carpentaria along with a large chunk of the interior, a relatively tropical but not very promising territory with unexplored mineral deposits. Neutral Sweden gaining significant territories which they'd almost certainly be unable to use would essentially shrink the border between France and Britain's claims and leave them with less inhospitable interior to manage themselves. Meanwhile, Portugal would gain lands along the coast of the Timor Sea roughly corresponding to Australia's top-end region right across the water from the Portuguese colony of Timor. Adjacent to Portugal's holding would be Spain's territory in Kimberley, and adjacent to that the Dutch holding in Pilbara. France would come away with the most valuable lands of the three challenging European powers, taking the southern coast of Western Australia along with a significant chunk of the interior. Portugal's colony would bring it not only a strategic vantage point from which to better oversee Timor, but also rich mining opportunities as well as an ability to cultivate exotic crops thanks to the region's unique tropical climate. Largely arid, Spain's colony would not appear as immediately lucrative as Portugal's, but did possess a good deal of mineral resources waiting to be extracted, primarily diamonds and bauxite. If nothing else, this colony would provide Spain another safe haven from which to manage operations in the Philippines. Much like Spain, the Dutch would have been given land appearing largely unfavorable, arid, and difficult to cultivate. However, as with much of Australia, the region offered significant mining opportunities containing some of the most iron-rich lands on the planet. Like Spain, however, these resources may go unexploited for some time, with the territory primarily functioning as a port from which it could better interact with its other nearby colony. France, in contrast, would get southwestern lands very mild in climate and very suitable for agriculture, but equally rich in minerals thanks to its interior possessions. Without any other territorial claims in the region, this would become France's new colony of focus in the Pacific, working toward building its settler population and developing it into a full-fledged colony far quicker than its counterparts in Western Australia. The same internal instability which rocked Spain in our timeline would still occur, leaving its colony in Australia to fall into neglect, never developing a large population. The Dutch as well would be preoccupied with pacifying the hostile populations of Indonesia, but would take this as an opportunity to develop its Australian coastline into a hub for resupplying and repairing ships, allowing for a quicker conquest of the Indonesian islands. Algeria would still be invaded and conquered by France with the purpose of permanently ending piracy from the Barbary coast, and as a response to a series of events which followed the Fan Affair. France and Spain would also later collaborate on the invasion and conquest of Vietnam, the French, like the Dutch, being able to draw upon local resources of the nearby Australian colony to complete the colonization process all the quicker. Despite the greater French drive for colonization, the more favorable quality of its colonial lands, and the rapidly rising domestic French population, the French settler population in Australia would never come close to matching that of the Anglo-Australian population. Britain was unique among the European powers in its ability to not merely conquer but extensively settle its occupied lands. Much as in the case of the Louisiana Territory, France would have likely concentrated the vast majority of their population in one single metropolitan hub whose economy was based in shipping and mercantile trade, with only a small fraction of that population expanding out to settle the interior and take on agricultural work. France's lacking ability to colonize was on display in both Algeria and Vietnam as well. Algeria, despite being only right across the Mediterranean from France, was only 10% French by 1950, while in Vietnam that number was less than 1%. France's best hope would be to follow an improved version of their strategy for colonizing Canada by creating not merely one permanent coastal settlement, but multiple interior settlements akin to the various Canadian trading posts which grew into small communities, but this time around establishing such communities with the purpose of permanently settling large populations. At most, we might imagine that by the end of the century, French Australia would bear a population of 100,000, which would pale in comparison to British Australia, which would stand at nearly 4 million by that same point. For this reason, France would attempt to maintain cordial relations with Britain to prevent a conquest of their colony, but Britain would not be the only threat France would need to face in Australia, as with the rise of the German Empire, so too would they now seek a slice of the Pacific for themselves. While we might suggest a claiming of French Australia by Germany following the Franco-Prussian War, if we assume France had thoroughly populated the territory sufficiently, it may prove impractical for Germany to attempt to rule it. That being said, there would likely be heavily underpopulated segments of French Australia which Germany could claim, but their overall value would be questionable. Instead, it's likely Germany would turn its attention toward attempting to annex or purchase New Guinea and the underpopulated colonies of Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands. However, Spain would soon be forced to cede its Australian colony to the United States following their defeat in the Spanish-American War, while New Guinea was seized earlier on by British Australia, now going by the name of Victoria. Germany, feeling excluded from this sphere, may grow hostile and attempt to forcibly extract a concession from the Dutch, Portuguese, Swedes, or Americans, potentially forming a closer alliance with Russia, who would have also felt excluded from the Pacific and who now had a navy capable of projecting its might into the region, perhaps leading to an alternate Russo-German-Japanese war which could serve as an impetus for a world war. But what do you think? What might have happened had there been a scramble for Australia? Let us know in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.